It began like any other ordinary day. The sun was hidden behind a clouded sky, casting a dull, almost eerie glow over the suburban neighborhood. A peaceful morning, with the sound of birds chirping and distant car engines humming, as if the world was still functioning, unaware of the chaos lurking on the horizon. Inside their cozy home, the Thompson family went about their usual routines. Sarah, the mother, busied herself with making breakfast, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Her husband, Daniel, a middle-aged man with a reassuring smile, was in the living room, trying to read the newspaper while keeping an eye on their two children, Lily, a bright-eyed teenager with a curiosity for everything strange, and Ben, a quiet 10-year-old boy who still believed in heroes and fairy tales. The family was content, oblivious to the storm gathering outside their front door. The news on the television had been odd. Reports of unusual violence, strange attacks, and inexplicable events spreading across the country, but nothing too concerning. It seemed like another one of those things that would blow over, a brief scare, a bump in the road of their otherwise normal lives. The world had seen its fair share of chaos, pandemics, economic collapse, civil unrest, but somehow, the Thompsons always managed to remain safe in their small corner of the world. However, Sarah's gut had a different feeling today, an unsettling premonition that something was off. At the breakfast table, Lily scrolled through her phone, her fingers quickly tapping across the screen as she read about a violent outbreak in a nearby city. "Hey, Mom, listen to this," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "There's some kind of virus spreading. People are turning violent, ripping into each other. The authorities are saying it's nothing to worry about, but it's all over the news. Isn't that weird?" Daniel looked up from his newspaper, his brow furrowed. "It's probably just another scare, kiddo. The news loves to make things sound worse than they are. We'll be fine." Sarah wasn't so sure. She'd heard the same whispers. There were stories, rumors, even footage circulating on social media that hinted at something far darker than a simple virus. The sudden rise in brutality, the strange behavior, the reports of people not acting like people anymore. Her instincts told her this was different. Something was coming. Outside, the wind began to pick up, howling through the streets as if nature itself was signaling a warning. The trees shook violently, and the sky darkened. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. That's when it happened. A loud crash echoed from the street. The family froze, all eyes turning to the window. A car, its tires screeching against the pavement, came careening down the road before slamming into a utility pole. The impact sent a massive jolt of shockwaves through the neighborhood, knocking power lines loose. The streetlights flickered and died, and the house was plunged into an eerie silence. Lily bolted from her seat, running to the window. What the heck just happened? That wasn't normal. "Stay back from the window," Sarah said sharply, her protective instincts kicking in as she reached for her phone. She called 911, but the line was busy. She tried again. Still nothing. Daniel stood up and walked toward the door, concern etched on his face. "Maybe it's just an accident. I'll go check it out." "No," Sarah said firmly, her voice trembling. "Stay inside, and lock the doors. Something's wrong, Daniel. I don't know how to explain it, but something's wrong." The tension in the room thickened as a loud, gut-wrenching scream echoed from the direction of the crash. It was followed by another. And then another. The noise was unlike anything they had ever heard, raw and primal, carrying the unmistakable sound of panic. "What the hell is going on out there?" Daniel muttered under his breath. Suddenly, the front door rattled. A heavy thump echoed against the wood, followed by frantic banging. The family's hearts raced. The sound was too frantic, too desperate. "Get away from the door!" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with fear. She ushered Lily and Ben to the back of the house, away from the windows and doors, her hand shaking as she locked every possible entry point. It felt as though the world was collapsing outside, and they were trapped in their home, with no escape. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse than a mere accident had taken place. Something that had no explanation, no warning. Her thoughts were cut short by a sudden crash that shook the entire house. The glass door to the backyard shattered, sending shards of glass skittering across the floor. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she backed away, her mind racing. What was happening to the world? What were they dealing with? The family huddled in the darkness of the hallway, waiting for the storm outside to pass. But deep down, they knew it wouldn't. It was just the beginning. And they were trapped. The house was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant, sporadic thumping from outside. Sarah's hands were shaking as she checked the windows once again. The neighborhood, which had always been so calm and familiar, now felt like a foreign, dangerous place. The streets were deserted, save for a few abandoned cars, some with doors wide open, others with windows shattered as if people had fled in a hurry. No one was walking around anymore. No more children playing, no more dogs barking. Just silence, broken only by the occasional scream and the sounds of distant crashes. Daniel stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the chaos that had unfolded in such a short time. This isn't right. This is not just an accident. What's happening out there? Sarah tried to steady her breath, her mind racing as she thought of their children. She couldn't let them see the panic she felt growing inside. She forced a calmness into her voice as she turned to Lily and Ben, who were huddled in the living room, their faces pale with fear. "Stay close, both of you," she said, her voice trying to mask the fear she could feel rising in her throat. "We're going to be okay. We just need to stay inside and wait for the authorities to tell us what's going on." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure they were true. Her gut told her that something was far worse than a simple emergency, something beyond even the worst-case scenario. Another loud crash echoed from the street, followed by what sounded like shouting, violent, uncontrolled yelling. Sarah's stomach tightened. It wasn't just panic anymore. It sounded like rage, pure and primal. She turned to Daniel, who was still looking out the window, his face tense. "We need to secure the house. This isn't just some accident. Whatever's going on, it's spreading." "I know," Daniel said, his voice low and serious. He moved to the front door, double-checking the locks, but Sarah knew it wasn't enough. The house felt fragile, like it could be torn apart at any moment. Lily grabbed her phone and started to scroll through the news again. Her eyes widened as she read a headline that made her blood run cold. Reports confirmed strange attacks across the country. Victims turn into aggressive, uncontrollable beasts. "Mom. Dad. Look at this," Lily said, her voice trembling. Sarah and Daniel both rushed over to her. The screen displayed grainy footage from a cell phone, showing a man attacking a woman in the middle of a city street. What caught Sarah off guard wasn't the violence, it was how the man moved. His movements were erratic, jerking unnaturally, and his eyes were wide and wild, filled with an unsettling hunger. And then, just as quickly, he was tackled by someone else, another attacker, just as crazed. "It's happening everywhere," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just here. It's happening all over." A deep sense of dread settled over the family. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she realized they had no idea what was coming. No idea what they were up against. The world was crumbling, and they were stuck in the middle of it, with no way to prepare. "Mom, what's happening?" Ben asked, his voice small and fragile. He was clutching his stuffed bear tightly, as if it could protect him from the terror creeping in through every crack and crevice of the house. Sarah knelt down beside him, forcing a smile. "I don't know, sweetie. But we're going to be okay. We just need to stay calm and wait for things to get better." But even as she spoke, she didn't believe it. Deep inside, a voice whispered that things weren't going to get better. That they were on the brink of something far worse than they could imagine. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed from the front door. It was frantic, quick, as if someone was trying to get in. The family froze. The sound was followed by desperate, panicked yelling. "Help! Please, help me! They're coming!" Before anyone could react, the door was hit with a violent crash. The wood splintered, and the door frame shook. Sarah rushed to the door, her pulse racing, but Daniel held her back. "Don't open it," he said urgently, his eyes wide with fear. "It could be one of them." The desperate banging continued, louder now, and the voice on the other side sounded frantic and terrified. "Please, please. Let me in. I'm not one of them, I swear." Lily ran to the window, trying to peer through the blinds. "There's someone out there, he's hurt. Stay away from the window," Daniel shouted, moving to block her view. But it was too late. The man on the other side had seen them, and his eyes were wild with fear and panic. They could hear him screaming now, begging for help, but the noise was mingled with something darker, a guttural sound, like a growl. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, torn between opening the door to help the man and the instinct to stay inside, to stay safe. Whatever was happening outside, they had no way of knowing who was still human and who was something else. Ben clutched her hand tightly. "Mom, what if we let him in?" Sarah's mind raced, torn between fear and compassion. But as she looked at the man's frantic eyes through the broken door, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just fear she saw, it was hunger. And deep down, Sarah knew that opening the door would be a mistake. They couldn't let him in. But the decision wasn't theirs to make. Just as Sarah took a step back from the door, a loud, horrifying shriek split the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet. The man outside was no longer begging. He was growling. And the thing behind him was far worse. The world outside had turned into something she could no longer recognize. The growl echoed through the house, sending a chill deep into Sarah's bones. It was unlike anything she had ever heard before. The desperate, frantic knocking had stopped, replaced by the terrifying sound of something unnatural creeping closer. Something that shouldn't be moving. The family stood frozen, every muscle tense, listening to the thumping sounds on the other side of the door. Ben whimpered softly, his small body trembling against Sarah's leg. Lily held her breath, her eyes wide in terror, her phone clutched in her hand as though it could somehow shield them from whatever was on the other side of the door. Sarah glanced at Daniel, her heart pounding. They couldn't stay here. The house felt too small, too vulnerable. It wouldn't be long before whatever was outside found its way in. The thought made her stomach churn. "We need to move," she whispered urgently, though she wasn't sure where they could go. "Get to the back of the house, away from the doors. Now." Daniel nodded, his jaw clenched in determination. He motioned for Lily and Ben to follow him, and they quickly made their way to the hallway, their footsteps muffled on the carpet. Sarah stayed close behind them, her eyes never leaving the front door. The shuffling outside grew louder, closer. The creature, or whatever it was moving around, its footsteps uneven, like it was dragging itself across the ground. There was no denying it anymore. They weren't dealing with a simple accident, or even a virus. Whatever was happening was far more sinister. This wasn't just an outbreak. This was something worse. As the family reached the back hallway, Sarah heard another sound. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. And then a heavy thump, like a body slamming against the door. Sarah flinched, but Daniel quickly grabbed her arm, his grip tight and reassuring. "Stay calm," he said, his voice low but steady. "We can't panic now. We need to think." He turned to the kids. "Lily, Ben, go into the kitchen. Find something to use as weapons. A knife, a frying pan, anything. We're going to need to protect ourselves." Lily nodded quickly and rushed to the kitchen, Ben right behind her. Sarah and Daniel stood in the hallway, waiting, listening to the sounds of chaos unfolding outside. They could hear more shuffling, more growling. And then, a sickening noise, a bone-chilling scream, followed by the unmistakable sound of something tearing. "They're here," Sarah muttered, her voice barely audible. Daniel gritted his teeth and took a step forward. "We don't know how many there are. We need to stay quiet, stay hidden, and wait for a chance to escape." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but then the noise outside escalated. The rattling of the door grew louder, the glass windows shaking violently as the creatures outside slammed into them, trying to break their way in. Lily and Ben returned, each holding a weapon, Lily with a butcher's knife, Ben gripping a metal frying pan that looked far too big for his small hands. Sarah didn't have the heart to tell them they weren't equipped for what was coming. "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" Lily asked, her voice shaking. Sarah didn't know how to answer. All she could do was nod, though deep down, she knew the truth. They were far from safe. Suddenly, the window in the living room shattered with a violent crash. The creatures outside were relentless. Through the jagged pieces of glass, Sarah saw the first glimpse of what they were up against, a creature, hunched and disfigured, its skin pale and mottled with dark patches. Its eyes were wide and bloodshot, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, as if the thing had forgotten what it meant to be human. It was crawling inside, its fingers scraping against the broken window. "Mom! They're inside!" Ben cried, his voice filled with panic. "Stay back!" Sarah shouted, grabbing her children and pulling them away from the window. She turned to Daniel, who was already positioning himself near the door, his fists clenched. "What now?" Sarah asked, her heart racing. "We fight," Daniel said firmly. "We fight to survive." But before they could make a move, the door burst open. The creature from outside had managed to break through, its twisted body crawling in with alarming speed, its eyes locked on the family. It let out a horrific screech, its mouth opening wide as it lunged toward them, its ragged breath stinking of decay. In a flash, Daniel grabbed the nearest object, a heavy chair from the kitchen, and hurled it toward the creature. The chair collided with its shoulder, knocking it off balance for a moment. But the thing didn't stop. It was relentless, undeterred. "Lily, Ben, go!" Sarah screamed, shoving her children toward the back of the house. "Run! Now!" But Ben hesitated, his wide eyes full of fear. "But Mom! We can't just leave you." "Go!" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling with desperation. She grabbed a nearby broomstick and swung it at the creature, knocking it back for just a moment. It staggered, but it didn't fall. It only grew angrier. Daniel pulled her back, his voice urgent. "We don't have time. Go!" Finally, Lily and Ben bolted toward the back door. But as they ran, Sarah could hear the screech of the creature, louder now, almost deafening, as it pursued them. "Stay close!" Daniel yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her along, toward the only escape they had left, the backyard, and the fence that might keep them safe, if they could reach it in time. The world outside had already turned into a nightmare, and now, the fight for survival was on. The Thompson family sprinted toward the back door, their hearts pounding, as the sounds of the creature's frenzied pursuit grew louder behind them. Sarah's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, and her mind raced, trying to process everything that was happening. It felt like a bad dream, an impossible nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. But there was no escape from the reality now. The world outside had descended into chaos, and their home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a death trap. As they reached the back door, Daniel threw it open with a violent push, and the family burst into the backyard. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, adding to the tension that hung thick in the air. The once peaceful suburban backyard now seemed alien, dangerous. The familiar fences, the neatly trimmed lawn, they had all been reduced to a harsh reminder of how quickly everything could fall apart. "Move!" Daniel urged, his voice urgent as he glanced back at the house. He could hear the creature crashing through the rooms, its screeching voice mingling with the sounds of shattered furniture and broken glass. They couldn't stop to look back. They had to keep running. The backyard was surrounded by a tall wooden fence that had been erected by the previous owners. The gate, however, was locked, and Sarah knew it would take precious moments to unlock it, moments they didn't have. Her eyes darted to the corner of the yard, where an old, rusted ladder leaned against the fence, its rungs bent and weathered. "Lily, Ben," she called, her voice trembling. "Climb over the fence, quickly." Lily, despite the terror in her eyes, moved without hesitation. She ran for the ladder, her hands gripping the rungs, and began to scramble up. Ben followed close behind, but he was slower, his small frame struggling with the ladder. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched them, helpless, wishing she could go first. But there was no time. The sounds of the creature's growls were growing louder, more insistent. "We have to go, now!" Daniel shouted, his voice sharp. He moved to the gate and began pulling at the lock, but the metal was old and stiff, refusing to budge. "Come on!" Sarah urged him, her eyes wide with fear. But Daniel wasn't listening. He was focused, determined to get the gate open. Suddenly, a horrid, guttural screech sounded from the house, followed by a loud crash. The creature had broken through the living room window and was now in the backyard. Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. They had to move, and fast. "Daniel, forget the gate." "Go," she cried. Daniel looked up from the lock, his eyes wide with fear, and nodded. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the fence. Lily had made it to the top, and Ben was close behind her, his tiny hands shaking as he reached the top rung. "Help me pull him up," Sarah called out to Lily. Lily reached down, grabbing Ben's hands, and together, they pulled him over the top, just as the creature let out another terrifying screech. Sarah's blood ran cold. It was too close. They had seconds, maybe less. Daniel helped Sarah climb, but she felt a terrifying sense of weightlessness as her foot missed a rung, and she almost lost her grip. Panic surged, but she gritted her teeth and climbed with renewed urgency. She couldn't afford to fall. She couldn't afford to be left behind. With one last desperate heave, Sarah pulled herself over the top and tumbled to the ground on the other side. She didn't stop to look around. She didn't stop to catch her breath. She grabbed Ben's hand, pulling him with her as Daniel and Lily followed. They ran as fast as their legs would carry them, deeper into the woods that bordered their backyard. The trees were thick here, casting long shadows as the sunlight began to fade, but it didn't offer them any comfort. The woods could be just as dangerous as the streets. And the creatures that had overrun their town were now everywhere. There was no safe place. As they pushed forward through the underbrush, the distant sounds of the creature's pursuit faded into the background. But Sarah didn't dare to stop. They had to keep moving. They had to survive. They finally came to a clearing, a small field just beyond the woods. It was quieter here, but the silence was unsettling. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the fear still gripped her chest, refusing to loosen its hold. "Where do we go now?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide with terror, and for the first time, Sarah noticed how much her daughter had changed. Lily had always been the strong one, the one who could handle anything. But now, she was just as lost and scared as the rest of them. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice thick with uncertainty. "But we can't go back. We have to find somewhere to hide, somewhere safe. We need to keep moving." Daniel looked out across the field, his eyes scanning the horizon. "There's a farmhouse a few miles from here," he said. "It's isolated. We can make it there. If we're lucky, it's untouched." It was their only option. They had no supplies, no plan, and no idea what awaited them on the other side of the woods. But they had no choice. They had to go. "Let's go," Sarah said, her voice firm. She was scared, more scared than she had ever been in her life, but she couldn't afford to show it. Her family needed her to be strong, and she would be, no matter what horrors awaited them. With one last glance over her shoulder, Sarah led her family out of the clearing and into the unknown. Every step they took felt like it could be their last. But there was one thing they had left, hope. And as long as they had that, they would survive. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in an eerie twilight. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. The Thompsons moved quickly through the woods, their hearts still racing from their escape, but with no real direction. The farmhouse Daniel had mentioned was still a few miles away, and each step felt heavier than the last, as the weight of fear began to wear them down. Sarah's legs ached, and she could feel the rawness in her throat from the hours of running and shouting. But she couldn't stop. Not now. The creatures were still out there, and the thought of what they'd left behind, those grotesque monsters creeping through their home, kept her moving, kept her pushing forward. How much farther? Lily asked, her voice strained, her legs stumbling slightly as she tried to keep pace with the others. Not much, Daniel replied, though Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The distance between them and the farmhouse seemed longer with every step. We need to get there before night falls completely. Once it's dark, it'll be even harder to see what's out there. The air grew cooler as the sky darkened, and Sarah felt an unsettling calm settle over the woods. It wasn't peaceful, there was nothing peaceful about it. The trees were silent, almost like they were waiting for something. Every now and then, Sarah thought she heard a branch snap in the distance, a rustle that made her heart leap into her throat. But when she turned, there was nothing. Behind them, the shadows seemed to deepen, and Sarah could almost sense the predators that might be lurking. Was it the creatures following them? Or was it something else? The woods were dangerous, and there was no telling what kind of horrors could be hiding in its depths. Ben tugged on her sleeve, pulling her attention back to him. "Mom, I'm tired. My legs hurt." Sarah knelt down beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. He was pale, his little face exhausted, and she could see the fear in his eyes. She knew he was scared, but she couldn't let him see how terrified she was too. She had to be strong for him, for all of them. "We're almost there, sweetie," she said, trying to offer him a smile. "Just a little bit more, okay? Then we can rest." Ben nodded weakly, his grip on her hand tightening. He didn't say anything else, but Sarah could see the quiet determination in his eyes. He was fighting just as hard as she was to stay strong. As they continued through the woods, the trees began to thin, and Sarah could just make out the faint outline of a building ahead, tall, dark, and looming in the distance. The farmhouse was in sight. "There it is," Daniel said with a breath of relief. "We made it." The sight of it brought mixed feelings. On one hand, it was a place of potential safety, a refuge. On the other, it was an unknown. What if the farmhouse wasn't safe? What if others had already taken shelter there, or worse, what if it was overrun by creatures? But it was their only choice. As they approached the farmhouse, they slowed their pace, each of them wary, their senses heightened. Daniel led the way, his eyes darting to the windows, scanning for movement. The farmhouse appeared abandoned, there were no lights on, no signs of life. But Sarah knew better than to assume it was empty. The world had changed overnight. What had once seemed like a quiet, peaceful farmhouse could easily become a death trap. Daniel reached the porch first and signaled for the family to stay back. He crouched low, peering inside through a cracked window. He didn't move for several moments, his face a mask of concentration. Then he stood up, his expression grim. "It's clear," he said quietly. "I don't think anyone's been here in a while." The family cautiously moved forward, making their way up the stairs to the porch. The wooden planks creaked beneath their feet, each step amplifying the tension in the air. Daniel reached for the door handle, but it was locked. "Should we knock?" Lily joked, though her nervous laugh made it clear she wasn't joking at all. Daniel ignored her attempt at humor, pulling a small rock from his pocket and smashing it against the glass of the door. The window shattered with a satisfying crack, and he reached inside, unbolting the door from the inside. The door swung open with a slow, eerie groan, revealing the dark interior of the farmhouse. It smelled stale, musty, like no one had been there in months. Dust floated lazily in the air, and the floorboards creaked beneath their weight. But to Sarah, it felt like a haven, a place where they could finally breathe, even if just for a moment. They stepped inside, their eyes adjusting to the dimness. There was a living room to their right, a staircase leading upstairs, and what looked like a kitchen in the far corner. The entire house seemed frozen in time. Nothing was disturbed, no signs of a struggle or any hint that anyone had been here recently. It felt like the people who once lived here had simply vanished. "Let's get some lights on," Daniel said, his voice low. "We need to see what we're working with." He moved into the kitchen, and Sarah followed, glad to be out of the cold night air. As Daniel fumbled with the lights, Sarah turned her attention to the room. The farmhouse was as plain as it was old, faded wallpaper, worn furniture, and shelves lined with dusty jars. But it felt safe. For the first time in hours, Sarah allowed herself to take a deep breath. But that sense of peace didn't last long. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood as they moved through it. Sarah's eyes darted to the window. The night had fully descended, and outside, the world was a different place, unfamiliar and dangerous. The creatures were still out there, lurking in the shadows, and their hunger hadn't faded. She turned away from the window, pushing her anxiety aside. It wasn't just the creatures she had to worry about anymore. It was the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But she was here, with her family, and as long as they were together, there was still hope. "Mom," Lily said, her voice quiet, "what now?" Sarah didn't have an answer. All she could do was hold her daughter's gaze, hoping her strength would be enough to carry them through whatever came next. The night settled in quickly, and with it came an unsettling stillness that seemed to permeate the walls of the farmhouse. The creaking of the old wood beneath their feet was the only sound that filled the space, a constant reminder that they were not alone in this strange, new world. Sarah stood by the window, peering through the cracked glass, her gaze lingering on the dark horizon beyond. The distant sounds of the night, rustling leaves, the occasional owl hoot, only seemed to emphasize the isolation they now faced. Despite the safety of the farmhouse, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as though the woods outside were alive, full of lurking dangers. Her heart beat heavily in her chest as she turned away from the window and rejoined her family in the kitchen. Lily sat at the worn wooden table, her eyes vacant as she stared down at her hands. Ben, on the other hand, was curled up on the old couch, clutching his stuffed bear, his expression one of quiet terror. Daniel was pacing in the corner, his brow furrowed, his mind clearly racing with 1,000 thoughts. The atmosphere in the room was thick with unease, each of them trapped in their own thoughts, their own fears. "We need to figure out our next move," Daniel said, his voice tight. "We can't just sit here and wait for the creatures to find us. We need to stay on the move." Sarah nodded, but the idea of leaving the farmhouse terrified her. It was the first shelter they had found since the chaos began, and the thought of stepping back into the unknown was overwhelming. "But where would we go?" "There's nothing left out there," she said, her voice wavering. Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and determination. "We can't stay here forever. This farmhouse might be safe for now, but it won't be in a few days. We need to find supplies, weapons, anything that might help us survive. And we need to find other survivors, if there are any left." Lily stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What if we're the last ones?" she asked, her voice cracking with emotion. "What if everyone else is already gone?" A heavy silence fell over the room as Sarah's heart sank. She didn't want to entertain the idea that they might be the last family standing, but deep down, she knew it was a possibility. The creatures, the chaos, the destruction, they had spread so quickly. How could anyone have survived? "We can't think like that," Daniel replied after a beat. "We have to believe there are others out there. And we have to keep moving forward, no matter how scary it is." Ben sat up from the couch, his small voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Mom," he said, his wide eyes searching hers. "What if the bad people come here? What if they find us?" Sarah's heart broke at the sight of her son's fear. He was so small, so innocent, and the weight of this new world was crushing him. She walked over to him, kneeling down to his level, and pulled him into a tight hug. "We won't let them find us," she whispered, her voice shaky but determined. "We'll keep you safe, I promise." The words felt hollow even as she said them. How could she guarantee his safety in a world where nothing was certain? Still, she had to believe that they could make it. For Ben, for Lily, for all of them. After a long pause, Daniel spoke again, his voice softer this time. We need to find a way to stay in contact with the outside world. A radio, something. We can't be completely cut off. Sarah glanced over at the kitchen counter, where an old landline phone sat, silent and lifeless. It was no good now, not in a world where electricity was becoming a luxury. She wished she had better news for Daniel, but she didn't. "I'll check the barn out back," Daniel said. "There might be something there, a battery-operated radio, even some tools we could use. We can't just sit here and wait for help. We have to help ourselves." Sarah didn't want him to go alone, but she knew it was the only option. "Be careful," she warned. "We don't know what's out there. Stay close, and come back quickly." Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "I'll be fine. Stay inside, lock the doors behind me." He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made his way to the back door, leaving the family behind in the relative safety of the farmhouse. Sarah watched him go, her mind filled with 100 what-ifs. What if he didn't come back? What if something was out there, waiting for him? The door clicked shut behind him, and Sarah immediately locked it, her hands trembling. The house seemed to close in around her, the silence louder now without Daniel's presence. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she turned to her children, both of them now seated at the table, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. "We're going to be okay," Sarah said, trying to offer some comfort, but the words tasted hollow. She knew it was as much for her as it was for them. Lily gave her a small, uncertain smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Ben, however, seemed to take comfort in her words, clutching his stuffed bear more tightly as he leaned into her. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows, and Sarah jumped at the sound of a distant thud, louder than anything she'd heard before. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it just the wind? Or was it something else? Another thud. Closer this time. "Mom," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's that sound?" Sarah's eyes widened in alarm. She turned toward the door, listening closely. The thud came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scraping along the ground. Without a word, Sarah motioned for Lily and Ben to stay quiet, her hand on the flashlight she had hidden in her pocket. She crept slowly toward the door, her breath shallow, her mind racing. What if they weren't alone? What if someone, or something, was already outside? The scraping sound grew louder, closer. And then, it stopped. Silence. And then, the door handle rattled. The door handle rattled again, more forcefully this time. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. The only thing separating her family from whatever was outside was that old, creaky door. She tried to steady her shaking hands, but the terror was too much. She could feel the weight of every decision, every moment that led them here, bearing down on her. "Mom?" Lily's voice was small, full of fear. Ben clutched onto her leg, his tiny fingers digging into her, as though his touch could anchor her to some semblance of safety. Sarah held her finger to her lips, signaling them to stay silent. Every instinct told her to run, to escape the farmhouse and find somewhere, anywhere else to hide. But her mind refused to move from the single, terrifying thought: if they didn't face whatever was out there now, they would never know what they were dealing with. The rattling stopped for a moment, followed by a heavy silence that stretched on, taut and nerve-wracking. Her ears rang with the silence, only broken by the sound of her own heartbeat. Then, a low groan echoed from the other side of the door. It was deep and guttural, and it made her blood run cold. It wasn't just the wind. It was something, someone, alive. Sarah's grip tightened on the flashlight in her hand. She didn't want to open the door, didn't want to see what lay beyond it. But she had no choice. They were trapped in the farmhouse, and if they didn't act now, they might never have the chance to. Her mind raced with options. Could she fight them off? Could they make it out the back door? But no. There was no time for hesitation. She needed to act before it was too late. Suddenly, she heard another noise. The unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps on the porch. Something was moving, slowly, deliberately, toward the door. They were closing in. "Ben, stay close," Sarah whispered urgently, her voice trembling. She turned to Daniel's bag on the counter, grabbing a few essentials, water, a couple of cans of food, and the flashlight. Lily stood, her eyes wide and desperate, searching Sarah's face. "What should we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to push back the rising panic. "We're going to stay calm. We're going to wait this out. Daniel will be back any second, and we'll figure this out together." The scraping against the door intensified. It was like fingernails on a chalkboard, slow, maddening. Sarah's teeth clenched as the sound became more pronounced. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. "Mom, please, what's out there?" Ben's voice cracked with fear, his small body trembling. "I don't know," Sarah lied, her heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. "But we're going to be okay. Just trust me." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the door, followed by another scraping sound, even louder than before. The door frame trembled under the impact. It was clear, whoever, or whatever, was on the other side, was strong, determined, and growing more impatient. Sarah's pulse quickened. They needed to get out, and they needed to do it now. She turned to the window, her eyes scanning the dark yard outside. The barn was just out of sight, but it was their best chance for an escape. They could make it there, and with luck, find another way out. Before she could say anything, the scraping noise stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so deafening, it felt like the world had gone still. Sarah strained to hear, her ears ringing. It was as if whatever was out there was holding its breath. Then, the silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of a thud, a forceful, heavy thud against the door, as if someone was trying to break it down. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Stay here," she whispered to Lily and Ben, motioning them to the far corner of the kitchen. "I'm going to check the back." She moved swiftly, careful to make no sound, her body tense with the anticipation of what might be lurking just beyond the door. The flashlight in her hand seemed almost useless in the thick darkness, but it was better than nothing. With every step, the pounding in her chest grew louder. As Sarah reached the back door, she paused, listening. The sound of the pounding continued at the front of the house, growing louder and more desperate, but there was nothing, no noise, coming from the back. Her fingers curled around the doorknob, trembling. She had to be quick. If they were going to get out of here, it had to be now. With a quick turn of the handle, the door creaked open just a crack, and Sarah peered into the yard. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. There was no sign of movement, no sound. Just the eerie stillness of the world around them. It seemed safe. For now. "Mom!" Lily called out, her voice rising in alarm from the kitchen. "The door! The door is moving!" Sarah's heart lurched in her chest. She turned back toward the house, the weight of what she had just heard striking her like a blow. The creatures, they were getting inside. She had no time to waste. With a final glance toward the dark yard, Sarah closed the back door and ran toward her children. She needed to make a choice, and fast. Stay here and risk being trapped in the farmhouse, or move out into the night with only the uncertain hope of reaching the barn. The thudding at the front door grew louder still, and then, suddenly, it stopped. The door was breaking. "Run!" Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the air with urgency. She grabbed Lily's hand and scooped Ben into her arms, dashing toward the back of the house. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it had become a death trap. They had to get out. The night wasn't safe, but the farmhouse had just become a beacon for what would come next. And what was coming was worse than anything they had imagined. The cold night air hit Sarah's face as she burst through the back door, her heart racing. She had no time to think, no time to second-guess herself. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far from the farmhouse as possible. The door behind them rattled again, this time with a force that made the entire house shudder. The creatures were inside. They wouldn't be safe for long. "Mom, where are we going?" Lily's voice was filled with panic, her hand gripping Sarah's tightly. "We're heading for the barn," Sarah replied, her voice strained but resolute. "It's the only place we have left." Ben clung to her chest, his small body trembling against hers. Sarah could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, the responsibility for their survival crushing her with every step. But she had to stay strong, for them. The moon cast eerie shadows across the yard, its pale light offering little comfort. The barn loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the night sky. It seemed so far away now, and Sarah's legs burned as they pushed forward, each step carrying them closer to the unknown. Behind them, the farmhouse creaked and groaned, and Sarah knew it wouldn't be long before the creatures discovered the back door. The pounding and scraping were growing louder, closer. They had to make it to the barn. Once they were inside, they could barricade themselves in and regroup. It would give them a moment of respite, a chance to figure out what to do next. But with every step, it felt like the ground beneath them was shifting, as if the world itself was turning against them. The sounds of the creatures grew louder, now mixed with other, more disturbing noises, snarls, shrieks, and the unmistakable shuffle of feet dragging across the earth. "We're almost there," Sarah muttered, more to herself than to her children. "Just a little longer." But just as they reached the edge of the yard, a new sound cut through the night, a screeching, terrifying noise that made Sarah freeze. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. A shadow moved in the darkness, large and monstrous. It wasn't one of the creatures she had seen before, it was something worse. Her stomach dropped as she realized what it was, a larger, more menacing figure, moving with a speed and ferocity she hadn't expected. The creature was close, too close. "Run!" Sarah screamed, pushing Lily and Ben forward. The barn was only a few feet away, but the creature was closing the gap fast. Sarah's mind raced. She had no weapon. No way to defend them. But she couldn't let this thing take her family. She grabbed a long piece of wood from the ground, her hands shaking as she prepared herself to fight. Lily turned to look back at her, terror in her eyes. "Mom, what do we do?" "Keep running," Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. There was no time to explain. They had to move. She swung the piece of wood at the creature as it lunged toward her, but it was too fast, too powerful. The wood connected with its arm, but the blow had little effect. The creature snarled in pain and fury, its grotesque face twisted in an expression of hunger. Before it could react, Sarah shoved Lily and Ben toward the barn doors. "Go! Get inside." Lily hesitated, fear paralyzing her for a moment. But Sarah's frantic shout broke the spell. "Go, now!" Lily and Ben ran, their small feet pounding on the dirt path, just as the creature lunged again, its grotesque jaws snapping dangerously close to Sarah. She was able to dodge it this time, but the creature wasn't alone. More shadows moved in the distance, emerging from the woods, drawn by the noise. "Please," Sarah whispered, her heart in her throat. She ran toward the barn, the sounds of the creatures chasing them now a cacophony of growls and snorts. She reached the barn door just as Lily and Ben slipped inside, and she slammed it shut behind them, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The barn was dimly lit by the faint moonlight filtering through cracks in the wood, but it was a sanctuary, at least for the moment. Sarah quickly bolted the door, her hands trembling as she worked to secure it. The creatures were still outside, scraping against the walls and groaning in frustration. But for now, they were safe. Lily collapsed against the far wall, her face pale and streaked with tears. Ben was curled in her arms, shaking uncontrollably. Sarah crouched down beside them, her heart aching at the sight of her children in such terror. "We made it," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "We're safe." But even as she said the words, the fear gnawing at her insides couldn't be ignored. They were safe for now, yes. But how long would that last? How many more nights like this would they endure? And what would happen when the food ran out, when the supplies dwindled? In the distance, the creatures' growls continued, but they couldn't get in, not yet. Sarah leaned back against the barn door, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. "We'll survive," she said, her voice firm, even if she wasn't sure she believed it herself. We have to. And with that, she wrapped her arms around her children, pulling them close. Outside, the world had turned into a nightmare. But inside this barn, for a moment, they had found a sliver of peace. And that, just for tonight, would have to be enough.